Michael Faraday was born on 22 September 1791. That's not such a great picture of him. He looks kind of menacing there. He was an English scientist. He's famous for contributions to the study of electromagnetism and electrochemistry. And some of you, your brains just shut off and you're ready to sleep now. He received actually very little formal education, but he was one of the most influential scientists in Western history. And it was by his research, with contributions from some other people, into the study of magnetic fields, around conductors with direct current, that we were able to understand the principle of electromagnetism. As a chemist, he discovered the compound benzene, which is used in all kinds of different uses even today. He was the first one to design what we would now call a Bunsen burner, and he is the one who popularized some terms that electrically minded people use all the time: anode, cathode, electrode, ion, things like that. Those were all words that he coined. He actually became such a popular and respected scientist that he was granted a position at the Royal Institution of Great Britain as the first in a series of professors of chemistry. But Faraday was born into a very poor family. At the age of 14, he dropped out of school. He apprenticed himself to a man who ran a bookshop and also did publishing in the back room. And in every spare moment when Michael wasn't delivering books or helping to print them, he was reading books that were in the bookshop, mostly books about nature and science and some of the discoveries that were happening in his lifetime. At the age of 20, he was able to attend a series of seminars led by another famous chemist, famous at that time. His name is kind of dropped out of history. But when he finished attending the seminars, he had 300 pages of handwritten notes. And so he had them bound in the bookshop and he mailed them to this chemist. And the chemist was so impressed that he asked Michael Faraday to be his assistant. And that's how Michael got into the world of science. At this point in history, most people who study this field would say that what Michael Faraday discovered is behind all forms of electrical generation in the world. It is that impactful. My name is Kevin Clark. If I haven't met you, I am the senior pastor at Encompass Church. I keep hearing my voice cut out. Are you guys hearing that too? So, okay. I don't know if that's me or what that is. I can switch to another mic if that helps. If you have a Bible or a Bible app, make your way to 1 Peter. We'll be in chapter 4 and 5. We'll be skipping through a couple of different passages. We're going to start in chapter 4, verse 12. This is week 3 in our series called Serious Times. I do not have control. You might have to click on the screen to give me back control. How are we doing there? Either that or you're going to have to follow me. So, okay, all right, we're gonna go for it the way it is. So you and I know that this series is based on the season that we live in right now. We actually are living in serious times. And our culture's rejection of Christianity and Jesus is intensifying. You know that this fall we face elections of great significance. Our choices of candidates and ballot measures will in many ways influence the direction that our society moves in the near future. But regardless of who wins and what wins, the election results are highly unlikely to make the average American move, think, and live in a more Christian or biblical way. And leaders who would like to implement policies that have biblical backing will continue to face an uphill battle because of the direction that our culture in general is moving. So in this season, I want to encourage everybody here within sound of my voice to remember that politics alone will never make a culture more Christian. Am I suggesting that we just throw up our hands and forget about politics? I am not. But if the candidates that we choose and the ballot measures that we vote for actually win, and then we continue to live life the way we've been living it for decades, lives that are no different in most respects than the lives of our friends and our neighbors, we are basically saying, I concede our culture to the enemy of our souls. The forces that are arrayed against us today and have been arrayed against us throughout history are far too big for politics alone to defeat. However, if you and I make it our personal mission to be a part of cultural change by changing the way that we personally live, the Holy Spirit may use the people in this room to make us part of turning the tide. And I've said this every week, the era in which Christians can live silently and invisibly in our society has come to an end. We must create a counterculture in which every person in this room, thank you, not people out there somewhere, are living lives that are visibly and vocally different from the lives of our friends and our neighbors. Not just on Sunday morning when you back out of the garage, but every day of the week. In this series, we're looking at 9 ways God tells us that we can change our culture and our world, which is really, I think, what most of us hope that the politicians we elect will be able to do. The first Christians in first century Jerusalem had none of the rights we have. They couldn't vote. They didn't have the right to free speech, to assembly, or to worship. And Rome, the power in place, ruled with an iron fist. Opposition got squashed as soon as they became aware of it. But those Christians completely changed not only their culture, but the world. And we can be used by God to do that again. The question is, what must we do to change our culture? In week 1, we discovered that each of us must live in authentic community. In week 2, we talked how each of us must live in unity of purpose. And today we're going to explore the idea that we must each live in a mindset of humility. Now, some of you, maybe more women than men, but that could be a generalization, probably just folded your arms mentally and dismissed everything that I'm going to say after this moment as irrelevant. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, humility is the last thing we need in this culture. What we need is to stand up and fight. We need to not become doormats for those who are pushing ideas that are destroying our world. I am not talking about becoming doormats. And if that is the only understanding that you have of humility, you have not understood what Scripture tells us about humility. So this morning, I'm going to ask for your patience, hear me out, and then decide. The book of 1 Peter was written into Christians living in very serious times in which their faith was thoroughly unwelcome to the culture at large, and active persecution at the government level was beginning to take place. In the middle of those serious circumstances, in chapter 4, verses 12 and 13, the author of 1 Peter, Peter, the disciple of Jesus, said this, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Peter said, don't be surprised that our culture is turning against us. Instead, rejoice at the fact you're suffering like Jesus did. Now, can you imagine how that was first received? Letters like this were probably read out loud in small house churches across the empire. In fact, we know Peter was writing to multiple cities, multiple house churches. Imagine what they thought when they heard Peter say that. Rejoice? Are you insane? Why in the world would we want to rejoice in our suffering? Peter proactively answers their question two ways. First, in verse 13, he says, if you share in Jesus' suffering, you will also rejoice in his glory. What he's essentially saying is, if you are the kind of believer, a person whose faith is really in Jesus, so that you are considered worthy of suffering for his sake and his name to our culture, you should know that you are also worthy of sharing in his glory when it comes. And then the second answer Peter gives begins in verse 17. He says, for it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Peter said, you want judgment against those who are persecuting you. But you need to know this. Before God judges his enemies, he always judges his people. The bad things that are happening to us right now aren't outside of God's will. God is intentionally using them to purify us, to compel us to stop living as if Jesus' commands are Jesus' suggestions. He is preparing us for the season that we now face. In other words, Peter is saying plainly, suffering is one way God prepares his people for his purpose. Now, when you and I look at the resistance and the resentment we see in our culture toward Christians, toward Christianity, we tend to think those things come from Satan. God would never cause his people discomfort or pain. But if we believe that, we believe in a fictional God, not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible will not hesitate to cause you and me discomfort and pain to force us out of our relaxed, passive, self-focused lives in which our primary goals are maximizing our comfort and minimizing our pain. And he will do that to prepare us for the role he has commanded, and that we, for the most part, have largely ignored. That of pointing other people to Jesus while there is still time. In verse 19, Peter says, therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Peter said, therefore, and that ties back to what he's just said, Since the suffering we are experiencing is coming from God and being used to prepare us for his purposes, therefore, we must entrust ourselves to him, not to powerful people, not to powerful policies, and we must do this while continuing to do good. And when he says doing good, he's not saying being nice to the people around us. He's saying do what God has said to do. Fulfill his purpose for you and me, visibly and vocally pointing people to Jesus. Now, as significant events are happening in our world, across the Middle East and in other places, and as opposition to Christianity and Jesus has intensified in recent years, I personally, this is me personally, I don't have any crystal ball or anything like that. I am becoming more and more convinced that we are in a season in which some people in this room will be alive to see Jesus come back. Now, I can't know that for certain, but it certainly feels like that is the direction we are headed. And if that is true, regardless of who or what wins the ballot box in November, pressure against Christ followers will continue to grow. We will continue to be regarded as less and less positive for our culture and our society. I am not saying it doesn't matter who wins this November. I'm saying politicians and policies cannot make culture more Christian. Instead, I believe that God is likely to increase what we perceive to be suffering to get us off the bench and into the game personally. How are we then to act? That's where humility becomes a part of the culture-changing scene. Turn to chapter 5, verses 1 to 4. Peter starts out just with the word so, which ties back to everything he said in chapter 4. So I summarize that for you. So, in light of the suffering you are experiencing, that God is using to get you into the game personally, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Peter says, in light of the things that are happening in our culture in which people hate us more and more, I will speak first to the elders, the leaders among you. First of all, know this, that I myself am an elder in the church. I'm a leader like you. I also witnessed Jesus' suffering myself. Like you know that I am counted worthy to suffer for Jesus' sake, which means I am also counted worthy to take part in his glory when it comes. But for now, leaders, shepherd God's flock. How, you ask, are you to shepherd God's flock? Peter gives 3 ways. Do it willingly, not out of duty or obligation, not out of compulsion. Grudging or reluctant leadership is disqualifying. He says, do it eagerly, not so that it benefits you personally, pardon me, but so that it benefits those whom you lead. Doing it for the attention or the paycheck alone is disqualifying. And then he says, do it humbly. Do not be domineering over those in your charge, but live as examples first. Do it out of a desire to show people what it means to follow Jesus humbly and faithfully, not out of a desire to control the behavior of others. Now, Peter was speaking specifically to elders in churches, those who served as the primary leadership roles. So most of us, when we read this, we think to ourselves, well, I'm not an elder, and so this doesn't really apply to me. But scholars are very quick to point out that in Peter's day, 99.9% of the churches were house churches. They were very small, perhaps 15 or maybe 20 people. They were not large like this. In fact, we don't even think the Jerusalem church was this large most of its existence, and it was probably the biggest one. But these churches were led, for the most part, by the heads of households in the houses in which they met. Those heads of households would be called not only to be the primary elders of their churches, but they would host the church as well. So it is likely that when Peter speaks of elders, he is speaking not just to a tiny little select group of hand-picked leaders. He is also speaking to every father, every head of household in which a church met across the New Testament region. Elders in Peter's day were responsible for leading, for protecting, for guiding, for feeding, and for teaching those in their care. And we're not talking about meeting physical needs, although if those needs arose, the church was compelled to meet those physical needs as well. We are talking about spiritual needs, leading, protecting, guiding, feeding, and teaching those in their care. Fathers, you have a responsibility for those in your care. So do mothers, but Peter tends to address men primarily. And so I'm pointing the finger at each of us in this room who wears the hat of father, and in some cases, grandfather. You have the spiritual responsibility of leading, protecting, guiding, feeding, and teaching, and doing all of that the way Peter said to do it, not domineering, but humbly, by example, not by mandate. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it looks like to lead humbly in a moment. But for now, I want you to hang on to this thought. Christian leaders are called to live humbly as examples. Now, clearly, pastors, elders, deacons, teachers, and I've said now heads of household would fall into that category of Christian leaders. What about the rest of us? Can we just kind of read past that and figure the humility thing is intended for someone else? No, Peter did not leave anyone out. Look at verses 5 through 9. It says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. Now, these verses, which are the heart of this overall passage, call everyone to humility. Now, first, Peter calls out younger believers. He says, be subject to the elders? Why did he call them out? They're the only group he actually calls out personally after he talks about the elders. Why? Are younger people more inclined, or rather less inclined, to be humble than older people? No. But many younger people, looking at the lives of us older people and thinking about the world that we have created that they are going to have to deal with, believe they can do better. And maybe they can. But they believe that knowing only in abstract the realities which they will face as they attempt to do that, and probably not realizing that their parents thought exactly the same thing 30 years before. Experience does not guarantee humility, but experience reflected upon can strongly contribute to it. Now, lest older believers feel overly confident, Peter immediately says this: clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. All of you, everyone. Influential or not, wealthy or not, powerful or not, beautiful or not. In fact, those most inclined to think that they do not need to clothe themselves with humility because they are already reasonably humble might be the ones who need to hear this the most. And Peter gives 4 reasons why we need to clothe ourselves in humility. The first reason, he says, is that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And we may see that and we may think, wow, I can think of a lot of proud people I'm familiar with in society, and it does not seem that God is opposing them in any way. Instead, they seem to be thriving in their pride. I need you to remember one thing. I'm sorry, I'm losing this microphone, so I'm going to have to do some adjusting while I talk here. But the one thing is this: when God opposes the proud, he opposes those who are his enemies differently than he opposes those who are already part of his family. In his desire to draw all men to him, he sometimes waits to impose judgment on the proud who are still defying him and have not put their faith yet in him. And you and I may not ever see that judgment until the next life. But if you and I, who call ourselves Jesus followers, become prideful, he often opposes us almost immediately in order to turn us back, to draw us to repentance and returning to him. The second reason Peter tells us we need to clothe ourselves with humility is this: at the proper time, God may exalt you. Those who exalt themselves gain the approval of human beings, and that's it. And that is generally what they are seeking. But human beings are woefully ill-equipped to understand what is worth exalting and what is not. But Peter promises that if we, on the other hand, demonstrate humility, then God, who is the only one who is qualified to determine who should be exalted and who should not, may do so for us in the proper time. What is the proper time? It might be in this life. It might be in the life to come. All we can know for certain is that whenever he does that, if he does that, he will do it on a timetable that is best for accomplishing his purposes. The third reason we need to clothe ourselves with humility is that we can cast all our cares upon him because he cares for us. Those who exalt themselves usually do it to alleviate some form of hidden or sometimes visible anxiety, a fear that they will not be respected or loved or seen as valuable. And so they call attention to themselves repeatedly in order to affirm to themselves that somebody somewhere thinks they are worth being alive. But Peter says a better solution is to cast all those anxieties on the only one who really knows how to care for what's really happening inside of your heart. And then the fourth reason we need to clothe ourselves with humility is that we have an active adversary, Satan, who is seeking to destroy us. Verses 8 and 9 say this: "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith." I am so sorry, guys. "Knowing that some kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world." Now, I think you and I have heard this passage many, many times, but the difficulty for us is that we tend to read these two verses separately from their context. Sermons are often preached on just these two verses, and they leave out what comes before in verses 5 through 7, the humility verses. But that diminishes Peter's meaning. He isn't just saying to his readers, hey, there's a Satan out there. He's real. Watch out for him because he's on a mission to take you out. That is true, but that is not how Peter wants his readers to understand it. What he's actually saying is that if you are not humble, you cannot be sober-minded and watchful. You cannot be wary of Satan who seeks to destroy you. In fact, if you are prideful, he will feed your pride and he will devour you by filling your ego with things that you think make you great. The only way to resist him firm in the faith is to live in humility before God and men. Peter is saying all Christians are called to clothe themselves in humility. But how do we do that? Now, you have probably heard a pretty famous quote about humility, which is often attributed to C.S. Lewis. And it says this: "Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less." That's a great quote, isn't it? But it's not C.S. Lewis. It's actually Rick Warren. Rick Warren was quoting or compressing a much bigger thing that C.S. Lewis actually said. And this is what C.S. Lewis said: "Do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble today. He will not be that sort of greasy, smarmy person who is always telling you that of course he is nobody. Probably all you will think about him, if he is really humble, is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. In fact, if anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that you are proud. That's a big step. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think you're not conceited, it means you're actually quite conceited indeed." Lewis begins in the right place. To clothe ourselves with humility, we have to recognize that we actually have a need for it. And most of us really deep down don't think that's a big need. Maybe in moments of self-awareness, but not often. The truth is that pride is the opposite of humility, and pride is always based on two things. Pride is based first on comparison. We compare ourselves, our ideas, our accomplishments, our wisdom, sometimes even our faith to that of other people, and we feel superior to them in one or more of those arenas. In the culture and the season in which we are now, In a highly charged political world, it's easy to open up a news app and read what the opposition candidate said or his or her party said and think to ourselves, I can't believe he or she could be so stupid, and to feel very, very superior. Or we go to school or we go to work and a coworker or a student says something that kind of catches us off guard, and we think, I can't believe he or she could have said that. Didn't they know better? Didn't they think before they did that? They're dumb. I just don't get it. But when we compare ourselves to other people, we are comparing ourselves to the wrong person. We ought to be comparing ourselves to Jesus. Can you imagine Jesus sitting up in heaven, eating a bowl of popcorn, and as an angel walks by, he grabs the angel's sleeve and he says, did you see what Kevin just said on the stage? I can't believe he's that stupid. We are comparing ourselves to the wrong person. And that leads to pride, not humility. But even saying that's true and recognizing that's true doesn't guarantee our humility. If we were to compare ourselves to Jesus in the heat of the moment and say to ourselves, what would Jesus do in this moment? Most of the time we think to ourselves, he would do exactly what I'm doing right now. We are convinced most of the time that we are nearly the equivalent morally to Jesus. Now, we'd never admit that, but that is the way we live. Author C.J. Mahaney, in a little book just called Humility, said, if you really want to develop humility, you need to remind yourself every day when you get out of bed that Jesus had to die for your stupidity and your sin. You are so far from being the person he has designed you to be that your only option must be humility, recognizing that he has given you something you could never in a million years hope to deserve. The other thing that pride is strongly based upon is our insatiable need to express how certain we are about specific things. We live in a culture permeated with unjustifiable certainty. We assume things are true simply because sources with which we already agree say they are true. And then we repeat those truths with insistent fervor, though we ourselves could never begin to verify whether or not those things are true. And that behavior is prideful and sinful and unchristian. And yes, that is the way our culture operates, but that is far from a valid justification for a Christian to use for doing that. If we who claim to be Jesus followers will not act differently than our culture, how can we ever hope to change our culture? We should dispense with comparison and with certainty. And instead, we should strive to grow dependence. Humility builds strong dependence on God for the outcomes that we desire. Humility is as worthy of the fight as politics is. In our pride, we believe we can resolve almost everything ourselves through human efforts. Yet the longer our season goes on, the more we will be slapped in the face with the reality that we have little to no power other than the things that we can do individually in the people around us to help change their culture. We have to wait, often feeling insufficient, inadequate, and powerless. But when we wait on the right person, God, rather than human politicians or policy, we find that we are rewarded. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 10 and 11 says this, "And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever." God promises that if we wait on him and we do it with humility, that he will restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish us. And that is not just a reference to the life after this one. We will see him do those things in us as we pursue the humility he has called us to pursue. John Piper, a pastor up in the upper Midwest, said this about humility. Humility is the disposition of the heart to be pleased with the infinite superiority of Christ over ourselves in every way. If you and I were actually to demonstrate humility, to stop comparing ourselves with other people and making ourselves superior in our minds, to stop being so certain about things we can't be certain about, that would look so different to our world. They would have no explanation for how we could live the way that we lived and have confidence in the future that is promised to us. Humility can change our culture. Michael Faraday is recognized as one of the most influential scientists in the Western world. However, he did not recognize himself as that. Each and every time he was corrected by someone else, he received those corrections with grace and gratitude, often writing to lesser scientists who sent him dogmatic, angry letters with gracious thanks for the errors they had pointed out in his work. In the middle of his life, he was offered a knighthood by the royal family. And he declined, saying that he felt like recognition was against the word of the Bible, which said you should not attempt to accumulate riches and pursue worldly reward. And he stated that he would prefer to remain plain old Mr. Faraday to the end of his life. Shortly before he died, he was offered a burial plot in Westminster Abbey, where kings and prime ministers are buried. They offered him the plot next to that of Isaac Newton. Michael Faraday said, "I am not worthy of that. Bury me next to my wife." As a man who followed the Lord, he knew that humility could change his world.